This is going to be easier than phonological awareness. But you might have noticed in the comprehension and analysis of age-appropriate texts that I think about half of the strategies have to do with information text. And that was deliberate for a number of reasons. We know that knowledge of what we call text structures helps somewhat in terms of comprehending text. So what do we mean by text structures? Well, narrative structure, you have a setting, you have characters, you usually have some problem that emerges, and then the rest of the plot, the rest of the story is trying to solve that problem. In information text, we don't have that kind of structure. We have a variety of structures. I mean, they're all, what makes something happen books, and they're all about books, and they're arranged. But they're certainly not the narrative structure. So the more we can expose children to those two different kinds of texts, so if they become familiar with, oh, this is a story, I have certain expectations for it, and that helps them then comprehend a narrative versus an information text. And likewise, they have a different level of alertness and different expectations for information text. So that's one reason. The other, there are a couple other reasons. In fact, there's a wonderful new study in Reading Research Quarterly by Price and a couple of other authors looking at parental reading to preschoolers, and they asked them to read one narrative and one information text. And what they were looking at is what are called extra-textual conversations, both how much commenting and talking outside of reading the text the parents did and also the children. And the amount of talk by both children and parents is much greater in the information text. During reading of narrative, parents tend to be quieter, as do children, during the basic reading of the story. There might be some conversation after the story. But during the reading, and even after, not as much as with information text. So if we're looking at story reading as a context for conversations and talk, it looks like expository text kind of naturally leads to a lot more of that. And there's some older studies, Pellegrini and that group, that also found much more talk around, with parents again, around information text compared to narrative. The other thing when it comes to vocabulary that we haven't talked about is this superficial knowledge, this identification knowledge, we know is not what really helps in reading comprehension. It's simply not enough. And knowing a word really means that you have a lot of what we call semantic connections to that word. So let's just take tree, common ordinary word. And let's say that a child can identify a picture, it's a tree. But let's suppose that we have other understandings. So we might have in a little box down here things like leaves, roots, branches, stems, bark. Okay, you see what that list is. And then you might have another list of elm, maple, oak. You might have another list, tree frog, tree house. And you might have in another category of family tree. Okay, and then I can add some other things if you're reading text and the expression is so-and-so branched out into many different things, or so-and-so's roots go very deep into the community, okay? Now, so my linguist friends who study that would say that you don't really know tree until you have a lot of those connections. And that's why the prediction from identification level of vocabulary, whether it's expressive or receptive, doesn't predict very well in terms of reading comprehension, because it's those relationships that we encounter in the sentences and paragraphs we read, all those connections that really is part of knowing what tree means. So information texts build the content knowledge. Now, a lot of people will say, and in fact it's the justification for using the Peabody as the probe for vocabulary and early reading first and not having any content measures. because vocabulary supposedly is a proxy for content. In other words, if you know tree, the assumption is you know something about trees. Well, I would call that into question these days because I see a lot of very straightforward, deliberate pictures being labeled. And that's basically the vocabulary instruction, as opposed to information texts, real activities, where they really know something about trees or whatever it is. So information books are full of information, obviously, and also when it comes to vocabulary, they tend to be quite explicit. I was looking at some books about spiders the other day. A spider is not an insect, it's an arachnid, right there. Whereas in narrative, even if the vocabulary is high level, in the sentences, it tends not to be explicitly explained. Now, sometimes you can extract it from, you can get the meaning from the context, but other times I don't think kids could, and that's why we support vocabulary in certain ways when we read. But information texts are just so explicit in instruction and vocabulary. So anyway, and they're interesting to children as well. So we put a lot of strategies in the comprehending analysis of text, put a lot of the information texts in there. So that's why there's so many items. So I hope you are using, there are wonderful information books out now for children, many more than 15 years ago or so, and there just weren't many. And I would encourage you, when you pick information texts, to pick ones that are really designed for kindergarten, first and second grade. You are reading these to children after all. You don't need the simple ones that are for the early readers in kindergarten. I looked at one about trees the other day. Title, trees, first page. This is a tree. These are the branches. These are the leaves. We should not be reading those to preschool children if we're trying to develop language and concepts. We need the richer books that are for the little bit older kids. We are reading them, so it'll work okay. Anyway, any comments or questions about information texts? And why that's so strong in the strategies? Yes.
May I ask a follow-up question to what you just said?
Sure.
Because as you described that last book, I'm seeing there's a genre out there of those see-through books. And
The discovery books.
The discovery books.
Mm-hmm.
And I see children really, really enjoying those. Now, I would not use that to read to children initially as an informational text. I hear you clearly. You need the narrative around it. But to put the narrative book into the children's library, they might not be able to fully utilize it the way they would the discovery book after you've introduced the information.
Mm-hmm. Well, you bring up a problem with information books, and that is to read those to a group of children, even a small group. They are not stories. They are not to be read in the same way that stories are. They aren't entertaining in the same way and gripping, what's going to happen to Corduroy or whatever. So you have to be very careful in how you read those. And I see teachers actually using them as resources. So they're doing a unit on whatever, and the construction unit that I saw in the classroom, the one with the building a skyscraper. And see, back in that block area, she was reading an information book on skyscrapers to the children in the block area. And she did read it all the way through. But sometimes I see books used where it's just a section of it, and for some reason you want to read that because something's come up. So I think we need to be very careful in thinking that we can read information books in story time and hold children's attention. But small groups, targeted pieces of the book, because you can read sections and use the diagrams and illustrations and get some of that across. And then there are, of course, some information books that are really structured, either as a predictable textbook or as a story. So I'm thinking of Chickens Aren't the Only Ones. The rhyme, and just the flow of that kind of keeps children with you. Or A House is a House for Me, the Hoberman one. I love that book. And it's so rich with all the houses and even the language. It gets more abstract as I go on, a secret. My head is a home for a secret. I mean, it's a beautiful book, kind of long. But if it's rhythmic and engaging, like Chickens Aren't the Only Ones, those beautiful pictures, you can keep children with you and you can read them in a group. However, here's the problem with those books. It's not information text structure. And we need to expose children to that structure. One thing I didn't say about that structure is it tends to be quite dense. You know, it'll take in a storybook 2 or 3 pages, you know, of kind of leading up to something. It's not very dense. Information books tend to be pow, 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 pow. I was looking at one on crayfish the other day, and it's, you know, crayfish are decapods. You know what that means? 10 legs. Okay. I didn't even think about that. Decapods. And then, like, the next sentence is, they have exoskeletons. Okay. I mean, every sentence. Now, I saw a teacher actually use that book, and she had an enlarged picture from another book with a human skeleton. And so as she read some of that book, she explained decapods as 10 legs, let's count them, because there was a great picture of a crayfish. And then she got to exoskeleton, and she said, oh, and I'll explain what that means. And she had the skeleton of the human body, and she had the kids feeling, you know, their bones inside. So we have bones on the insides of our bodies, but crayfish don't. I mean, she was making this sound like, oh, and I just know you want to know this. I mean, you know, some of these teachers, it's just, and they can make it so interesting for the children. Anyway, so, but here she was going through, but she was illustrating. I mean, she was explaining and illustrating almost after every sentence. And she read a lot of that book and got through it, but she was very, very skilled in how she did that. So you have to be careful. So there's a whole series of insect books. On the back it says, these are written for preschoolers, information books, you know, just for preschoolers. But they're written in a fictional style. So there's this, I can't even describe it. Are you a grasshopper? And the grasshopper's talking back. I mean, what's an information book? What are we doing? You know, why are we fictionalizing this and having grasshoppers talk? I mean, that's narrative, you know. So we can't just stick with the real thing, I think. You know, preschoolers are okay. We can stick with the real thing. We don't have to make it cute and story. You know, they can handle it. But we have to be careful how we do it. Okay. Hand back there.
A while ago, I read something about preschool girls preferring fiction and boys preferring nonfiction.
I run across that all the time. And, you know, I don't know the studies that suggest that. The question is, she'd read that girls prefer fiction and boys prefer nonfiction. Now, my guess is it's not genetic. My guess is that very early on, we used different books with different gender children. And I think, you know, I don't know this for sure, but I think the activities we engage girls in as opposed to boys maybe tend not to be as content rich. I only have one child, it's a boy. And boy, did he love information books. And in fact, he was about 4.5 or 5, and he really had all the literacy skills to learn to read. He would not spend a minute with any simple storybook, predictable textbook that I was trying to get him to, you know, read for his, you know, bedtime story. No, those weren't fun. They weren't interesting. He wanted chapter books on planets and the human body and all those kinds of things. So I thought, well, okay, well, we'll have great vocabulary, and, you know, someday he'll learn to read. And actually, he went through all of kindergarten, saying just adamant about he would not engage with any simple kind of book. And he was in first grade. It was about November. And I picked him up one day, and he said on the way home, Mom, there are kids in my class who can read. I can't. So I said, well, I've been trying to help you for like a year and a half now. And what it's going to take is we're going to have to pull out Go Dog Go and some of those things. And so I said, okay, we will. So I pulled that one out that night from his shelf, and we read it several times. And then he read it, of course, it's a familiar textbook. He was doing true finger point reading, which we ought to talk about. I had always thought before Lene Aries could study that they had just remembered where the words were and were matching. That's not how the process works. They had the memorized verbal version in their heads. They are calling that up. So let's just take Mrs. Wishy-Washy. It's an easy one. So Mrs. Segmenting the first sound of that word and then knowing that an M is used to represent that. Looking for the word that starts with M. That's why it's so slow and laborious when you have children who are really finger point reading. They are mapping on. Well, anyway, so he had enough skill, see, that he could finger point read. And then, of course, he knew the book, so pretty soon it was like a split. So then what I did was, he had a Halloween book that he liked. What was it? The Berenstain Bears, the Squeaky Old Wall, or something like that. And more text. And so I thought, I want to get him in a book that's less familiar, more challenging, to really make him deploy those decoding skills. Well, after the first page, he said, it's too hard. I'm not going to do any more of this. I said, well, you read a page and I'll read a page. And then when he would falter and miscue a word, I just gave it to him. The message, what they say, I just gave it to him. And within about 3 months, he must have been reading at whatever level, but he wanted to learn to read at that point. And he was willing to go to simple books. But he was so into information books, and big-time information books. So were his friends. But I think it's exposure to those kinds of books. We always had a lot of information books, and we were big science museum fans, and so are the boys I know who go. So I suspect that girls can be as interested in content as boys, but those paths get in different directions. So, but in classrooms where I see content and information books used now, the girls are just as interested in the books that are being used as boys. In some of the classrooms I work with, a lot of information books around. And content teaching real things like snails and earthworms and fish and crayfish, real things. So I don't know. Yes?
I have 3 sons, and I had one was in the information book, one was in the book about slime, and whatever he could find that was a monster.
Yeah.
And I had one that was just, let the book find me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
yeah.
Individual.
Individual.
I just hate to see us saying boys will do this, and boys, we need to have them exposed. They need to be exposed to everything.
I agree.
And they need to have the opportunity to choose what works for them.
They do, and yet, if there's one tendency that shuts out all other experiences, I think education, part of its role is to broaden interests and engagement. So I mean, I felt for the books at home that he wanted us to read for good nighttime stories. I mean, that was his choice. I couldn't, but I was sure talking to his teacher a bit about other exposures, and he listened to stories in preschool and kindergarten, so I knew that was covered. But he was not willing to use those. But anyway, the kids are different, certainly.
Yeah, and we should also encourage our parents to do little book trips with them to Barnes and Nobles, even though they don't buy the books.
Yeah, you can sit and read. Yeah.
Because my kids are all grown and out of college now, but they still go to the bookstore. In fact, my son met his fiance.
Well, there you go.
But they still have a habit of going to the bookstore and reading.
Uh-huh.
And so reading is very important to all 3 of them.
Right, yeah. Okay, anything else on information text and balance? Yes.
I have a distracted question that why most children's pictures book have no page number?
Oh, I don't know, and it drives me nuts. Why children's picture books have no page numbers. Information books do. I really do not know how that got started or why, but they do not have numbers, yeah. And when they're kind of writing plans for teachers or you want to refer to certain pages, I just start numbering on my narratives. I start numbering the pages. I have no idea. Yeah, but it's true. They don't have page numbers. Now, certainly adult fiction does, but I don't know why picture books don't. Good question. Okay, shall we move on? Okay. Okay. Now, back to integration that we talked about a little bit this morning.